trojans2.com.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to Tristram for making our point so forcefully on this side of the House. Observing Aden's independence ceremony in 1967, a British diplomat told the Defence Secretary that the Empire's main legacies would be association football and the phrase "fuck off." Whilst football and colourful expletives have indeed been major bequests of British imperialism, there are others, less harmless legacies too, many of which continue to have relevance in a world shaped by the 300-year phenomenon that was the West's imperial dominance over the rest of the world. Now, we need to rework this schoolboy debating question in our minds so that it embraces the causes of the current ills of Britain's former colonies, many of which, as Tristram has said, were firmly rooted in British imperialism. This is more important than compiling Britain's crime sheet and apportioning blame. Whilst the evidence regarding the British Empire's creation or exacerbation of multifarious ills that continue to afflict the world is compelling, I believe that this debate can't be won simply by rehearsing a litany of bad things associated with empire, such as Kashmir or Ireland, or the entrenchment of racialized and ethnically divided societies. What we need to avoid is getting wrapped up in the blame game, despite the title of the motion. If instead we focus on causality, we can learn about the true nature of the problems facing many of Britain's former colonies today. Rather than dallying with the redundant act of apportioning blame, we can instead acknowledge the responsibility of previous generations of Britons. What this does is to allow us to achieve something much more positive, an understanding of the roots of today's problems, and something that Britain can help with, and that is providing solutions. Of course, one would not wish to claim that Britain is to blame for all the ills in former colonies. That would be absurd. Taking Africa as an example, there is no doubt that it has been atrocious, venal, murderous leadership since decolonisation that has accounted for many of the continent's ills. But the state apparatus that Africa's leaders have struggled to operate or have hijacked for their own malfeasant purposes is a key aspect of the colonial legacy and very recent history, as are the patriarchal, undemocratic, authoritarian political structures that Britain helped to purvey during its rule, often from the pre-colonial roots that Tristram mentions, as well as an international system still dominated by astonishing global inequalities set in stone by Western imperialism. This is all recent history, indeed to a large extent the here and now. So it's not possible to argue that imperialism is old hat and no longer relevant to the shaping of the modern world. It's no good in response to the argument on this side of the House to start listing the positives of British rule. Whilst the question, what did the Romans ever do for us, might have given Monty Python a classic moment, it's a pointless historical exercise in terms of considering British imperialism, because it's not a competition to audit the good versus the bad and see who wins. And it's also counterfactual, because we can simply never know what these disparate peoples would have managed to achieve without British subjugation and rule. Furthermore, those who argue in favour of the positive effects of British rule tend to focus on a more benign late colonial period, but that was itself founded upon often wicked acts and the abject subjugation and emasculation of indigenous societies. Imperialism at its heart seldom moved from the foundations identified by Lord Derby in the 1870s. Its purpose was to occupy, fortify, grab, and brag. One of the most enduring legacies of colonial rule that still foxes many former colonies is, of course, the nation-state itself. This, of course, isn't to say that the nation-state is bad per se, though Basil Davidson did memorably refer to it as the black man's burden. It is because of the fact that it was put in place in societies that were simply not ready for it following hasty decolonizations, that it was fundamentally alien in creation, and that colonies hadn't had the chance to develop their own forms of statehood and negotiate their own entry into the emerging world order because of the irruption of colonialism. The state came into being with very often ethnic divisions firmly entrenched, limiting the chances of cross-ethnic national identity emerging. Because the British, of course, had ruled through distinct ethnic units. They had made worse the pre-colonial system in many places that Tristram referred to. It is no surprise that so many of these colonies turned nations failed and are failing today, and that they were soon hijacked by corrupt elites, usually manned by men that the British had groomed. This led directly to the corrupt states and failed states that are such a feature of the world today. Colonies were never intended to be nation-states, and so the quick about turn that was at the heart of rapid decolonization meant that new nations, though they might have the trappings of statehood, did not have its essence or its substance, and they often struggle for it still. They were also bequeathed the crushing economic problems associated with monocrop economies, and often chronic internal burdens associated with things like ethnic politics and white land appropriation. There are, of course, then some very real cases of blame, if we want to use that word, that simply will never change. We can't ever make up for or explain away the evils of slavery. We cannot bring back to life native peoples in countries like Tasmania, wiped out by the murder and disease associated with the irruption of what has been termed settlerism. The passage of time does not alter historical fact. Not, of course, that we today should be guiltily apologizing, but we should squarely acknowledge what was done by our countrymen in the past. In framing this debate, we must also extend our scope to consider the psychological costs of colonialism, which are often quite difficult for British people to empathize with for good reason. But the fact of having one's culture demeaned and devalued, and to be told instead that European culture in all its forms was superior, to then be told that even if you engaged with that European culture and became, say, more English than the English, that the colour of your skin simply debarred you from equality, was exceedingly debilitating and is alive in the world today. The most hardy of imperial lies, that if a person adopted British ways they would be treated as equal, was culturally one of the most pernicious aspects of imperialism. These legacies and those associated with ingrained racial prejudice still blight the world, and we have a long way to go before the decolonization of the Western mind is complete. Even after the empire had all but ended, Western powers, with their structural adjustment programs and support for Cold War dictators, remained the arbiters of the affairs of former colonies, and the record is poor. Neocolonialism is alive and well, and rather than denying the blame of past colonial rule, we should look closer to home and realize that we're not out of the woods yet ourselves. And in conclusion, my argument is that we need to broaden the scope of the question to allow us to properly understand the causes of the ills of former colonies, of the responsibility our forebears bore, and of our own ability through this knowledge to better help address those ills. In so doing, we strengthen former colonies and help engender a more equitable international system, and perhaps help find a new role for Britain within it. Thank you very much.